Is there other question? Ludo, go ahead.
Yeah, I have a question. Maybe with the same idea of if we modify some parts, of if we add some processing to improve the results. Do you think that using gazetteers or specific gazetteer for this period will help the NER tools? Or do you already use some kind of dictionaries with toponyms?
For sure, we consider that using gazetteers from this period, we will improve even more results. We didn't apply yet, but of course, it's in our plans to add more specific gazetteers. Yeah, normally it will improve.
Yeah, maybe I can add something specifically on the results of Kaizen for recall. You see that there is a huge improvement with manual modernization. And actually, it's because of all those old proper nouns written as in the 16th or 17th century, Espagne, Allemagne, etc., which are not at all recognized and which are not modernized by our current modernization algorithm. And so you see this could be applied either inside the NER recognition tool to add the gazetteer there, or as a pre-processing in the modernization step by modernizing proper nouns also automatically.
Yes, go ahead. There's Patty and Catherine. So I say in order. No, maybe Catherine, go ahead. You're privileged because you are in the audience. Yes, go ahead. Go ahead.
Sorry. Yeah, no, I'm really excited about this paper. Thanks very much for presenting. And I guess my question is really about the payoff of normalization and actually how doing that kind of changes what you're actually capturing in terms of the way that places are written about in these texts. And I know that might not always be true, but I'm wondering if you see the advantages outweighing any potential disadvantages. And then a second question is really about, what counts as a place? And especially given the interest in mapping these out in the kind of following step, I'm wondering to what degree eliminating more complex place names or places that are embedded within other kinds of entities. And I'm thinking specifically of roads and buildings or names of buildings, institutions, like Patty has mentioned earlier for another paper. How much those are kind of embedded in these narratives and whether those tell a kind of slightly different spatial narrative than other texts, and if that's interesting for the corpus as a whole.
I'm not quite sure they will understand the first part of the question. So if Philip would like to answer.
Yeah, maybe. So the bad impacts of normalization, maybe when normalization fails. Well, currently, actually, we don't fail much in the sense that we don't create absurd things in the normalized version, because as you saw, this alignment algorithm is quite straightforward, but also this algorithm completely lacks the problems of, well, it doesn't treat the problem of ambiguities, for example. So those complex, those words which could be either past participles or adjectives, or, well, they are not treated by this relatively simple approach, because the good results are obtained by the approach just by treating well the easy cases, actually. And we do better than some other approaches that we've seen in the literature. So maybe if we treated directly the original texts, it would be better, because we would take into account those ambiguous words with the correct, for example, morphosyntactic tag. So I think it may be better to treat it directly. Also, maybe the fact that we normalize before treating the text means that if we want to reincorporate the text, the text back in the original text, we must again do an alignment approach and re-put the text in the text, and that's not really practical. But yeah, that's it for this. These advantages, we saw more advantages. About the second part, I need you. You have a few insights? Or?
After all, our purpose is to make guided tours for the cities. So the idea is that the user in the application will manually add specifications about the location. So it would be more easy to handle.
Yeah, I think there is this whole step that we don't really handle in the paper, which is how do you really locate the different named entities which have been noticed. And even though we focus on proper nouns, nothing prevents us from, in the next step, incorporating the context and trying to see if adding a few words before or after helps us to distinguish between the two locations. And of course, also to imply human knowledge about this, because it's easier to locate a small number of named entities than to read the whole text to find the named entities. And especially with tools such as GeoVis or Recogito that we heard earlier, this task is made a little bit easier. And maybe a second aspect of this question is that we want also to study specifically nouns, not proper nouns, but common nouns related with the city, with urban vocabulary. And so this is where we will get the churches, the streets, the boulevards, etc. And so, yeah, we really see this as a second step, which will depend on what really we want to do. So Eleni spoke about this main goal, which is doing those city walks. And of course, here we will need at some point to find the streets and the churches and the castles. But also for the itineraries, which is also interesting for our colleagues in literature. Of course, when we just have the locations extracted from the text, it's not enough to build this this trip of one famous lady of the 17th century. But then, yeah, then we have human knowledge to distinguish the places where those women go from the places that are just mentioned in the text, or we have other tools to make this machine learning task actually of distinguishing between the two.
Thanks.
Great.
Can I go?
Do you want to go, Patty? Go ahead.
Yes, thank you. It's very much, I think, along the lines of what Katie was actually asking you about regarding the payoff particularly, because at the end of the day, I think these kind of methodologies, right, they are going to be used in order to enrich the analysis that we do of a text in the humanities, right? Or that is in a way the final purpose of all these techniques, right? And one could actually say, right, so it depends on the purpose, right? So one purpose might be to actually then go into the next step, which will be to create maybe a gazetteer and put coordinates to it, and then do things like geographical text analysis and things like that, right? Another purpose might be actually to look at the change over time in place names, right? And this is something that is very interesting to me because you do have that you might not want to standardize all the time all the place names, because what you actually want to learn about is the variants that you have, right? And I will say it is, we have worked, for instance, with 16th century Mexican material. So basically early colonial texts. And we find, for instance, that many of the variants in the place names that we identify can be then later on crucial to actually disambiguate, for instance, part of the narratives or which things are referring to and so on. So I guess it will be very interesting. It's more than a question, it's more like a comment, basically. I think it will be very nice to identify the different lines of work that NLP is basically going for, depending on the purposes that we are looking to solve, or the questions that we are looking to solve in the humanities, right?
Yeah, exactly. Indeed, we realized that our three texts are really different between them. And the scores, of course, are really different in terms of precision, recall, and F score. So yes, every time it depends on text, what kind of text we will process. Yeah, indeed, variance is a great subject to analyze. Of course, there are also some entities that they don't exist anymore, and but what is really interesting is the point of view of rules, tools dealing with rules, that they can handle this kind of entity recognition, even if there isn't in the gazetteer. So sort of we can recognize even it doesn't exist in the gazetteer, the entity. So that is really interesting, but also it is interesting to analyze the variation, chronological variation inside the entities of our texts.
Yeah, and maybe something about the different NLP tasks that we must apply, like one brick after the other. Coming from bioinformatics, I have seen that this was the case in the beginning, that we tried to identify the appropriate problem and to solve it independently from the previous one and the next one. And at some point, people started to try to take all of them up into account in the same time by building probabilistic approaches, which are much more complex. And I think maybe we are going there with digital humanities at some point, but we still have hard NLP tasks to solve independently from the others. So maybe we first try to focus on this alone before maybe trying to incorporate several things together.
Well, thank you for that, Philippe, and thank you, Eleni, for this contribution. I think I will stop the question part because time is passing. But at least one last question. No one. Okay, that's it. So we finish. Well, thank you again, Eleni and Philippe.